Hello, I'm here to talk to you about the most exciting thing about Sim, writing world-class detections and stopping the bad guys. Oh, wait, no, never mind, actually. I'm actually going to talk to you about metrics, which is equally as exciting. Before we jump into the exciting world of metrics, I should probably just tell you who I am. Here's my credentials. I thought I would just list out what I'm good at. So if you're looking at the expert in hand holding, question asking, problem solving, and occasional boxes and line drawing, I'm your guy. Otherwise, I'm also what you call a solutions engineer here at Greylog. So I'm a technical arm of helping people get the best out of their solution and deciding whether Greylog's a good fit for them. Previous to that, though, I cut my teeth in security operations and security engineering for financial services and telcos and that kind of thing. Why embrace the red and measure what matters. Originally, my talk was actually going to be called Why Sim Metrics Suck and How to Make Them Better. As I was writing this talk, I actually started thinking about throughout my time in sort of building metrics, the only time that anything really ever got done in the security operations center was when we marked things as red or when we reported a problem, when we said things were good and our team was performing well. Everybody just said, great, let's move on to the next week. And thinking about this as I was writing my talk, one of the things that I personally really struggled with when I first started out my career, when I was a security engineer, if I really wanted buy-in for a new product or a new tool, how to actually secure the buy-in of stakeholders to actually bring that tool in. An example of this was one of the things that I really wanted to bring in an automated tool for config management for AWS. When we deployed AWS resources, they were all deployed with a consistent security policy and were all deployed in a consistent manner. What I didn't think of at the time was rather than just saying, I want this tool, it's going to save us all this time, I never thought to actually quantify how much time we were actually spending doing manual security evaluations of new AWS resources, which if I had done and have created some metrics around that, possibly would have ended up getting that tool instead of continuing to manually evaluate everything. We talked a little bit about why the talk is called Embrace Red. When it comes to essentially bringing in a SIM tool or like any security tool in general, the reality is decisions are ultimately made in rooms like this on our slide, in boardrooms or just meeting rooms in general by management. This one's actually our Greylog boardroom. Unfortunately, when it comes to metrics in general, people tend to think about them in this red, amber, green context. When it comes to SIM specifically, like we can have the best SIM in the world with all these world-class detections, we can have full MITRE ATT&CK coverage and all these things. Unless we can really explain to somebody in these rooms, to specifically people that maybe don't have any concept of kind of what a SIM is, what the security program actually does, they might just see your SIM as an additional cost or a line item that can be cut eventually. That's how we end up with SIM replacement projects every 2 or 3 years, as a lot of our customers experience and I've experienced as well. A good example of preparing your metrics for these sorts of meetings are my next slide here. Like on the left, if we simply report something like our analyst hours per month, if our target is for an analyst to conduct 160 hours of work each month, if they work 140 hours, it looks fine. If they work 240 hours on the left, it's very difficult to distinguish whether that's good or bad. Whereas if we just add some color to it on the right and it's shown on a screen that somebody might look at for 5 seconds or 10 seconds, like it's very obvious. In June, we had a major problem because our analysts were working 240 hours when they're only supposed to work 100. In these sort of meeting rooms where people are looking at things for a very short period of time, it does help to add these colors, even if it sounds stupid. To highlight some sort of misconceptions about red. Some people think like reporting red on your metrics are bad. Red doesn't always mean bad. If you've got a car and like you get an oil warning come on, it's red. It doesn't necessarily mean that something bad is happening, but something that's highlighted that needs maintenance, it needs some sort of work to bring it back into a good condition. Reporting red doesn't always necessarily need to make you look bad either. Just because you say my team's overworked, my sim isn't working as it should, it doesn't mean that your team is performing poorly. It just means that you're identifying issues, identifying gaps that you know that you need to make. But if you don't report these things, nothing will ever get done about them. Just because you report something as red, you're not going to end up like this chap in the image and get thrown out the window. When customers come to talk to us about purchasing a sim, or maybe they have a sim in place already and they're just looking for some advice, one of the things that we tend to ask is like, how do you plan on measuring the effectiveness of your sim? We talk a lot about building the right detection logic, collecting the right logs. Ultimately, you really have to think about how are you actually going to measure that your sim works the way that you want it to. It's extremely surprising how little people actually have an answer to this. A lot of people say, we need a sim, we need to build some detections, we need like a capability to alert us on our logs. They don't really think about like how they're actually going to justify the cost of that solution. If you're going to spend thousands of pounds on something, you better know whether it's actually going to work properly or not, or be able to measure if it works properly. A few people come into us with some of these reasons. On my next slide, they come to us and say, we need a sim, or maybe they come to us and say, we need a better sim, we need a cheaper sim. And they complain of certain things when it comes to sim. They talk about analysts suffering from alert fatigue. They say that people have long investigation times, they're missing data or log sources, they don't have the automation that they would like. But when we ask questions and drill into what they mean by that, they don't really have a way to quantify it. If we ask them, how long do your investigations actually take on average? They often say, they take a long time, but we don't really have metrics about how long they actually take on average. But it's difficult to actually say like that this is an actual problem. And if they come to Greylog, how we can actually make that better if we don't know what the actual problem is. If you suffer from some of these things in your sim today, or even in Greylog, you might want to think about doing some investigations, like highlighting how long do your investigations actually take? How many alerts are your analysts actually investigating each day? What is causing that fatigue? Really understand the problem of your sim in detail and things like that. People also often say measuring sim is hard because it doesn't necessarily work in the same way that other security appliances do. If I have a firewall, like I can really quantify how many sort of different types of traffic it can block, what attacks it can block, it prevents specific things. Whereas what we do in SIEM is take all our logs together, mishmash them, and build high fidelity alerts on the other end, which can be harder to measure because it's not as simple as saying our SIEM helped detect X amount of alerts or prevented X amount of attacks each month. That begs the question of where do you actually start when it comes to building a metric? The reality is it's never going to be perfect on the first pass. It's a lot like building a detection inside your SIEM now that I think about it. Like you bring in your logs, you build detections, you refine it over time, you remove false positives, false negatives, and you do this sort of process, which a lot of people refer to as crawl, walk, run. You can do the same thing with metrics, right? You can just simply pick a metric. You can pick something really simple. One that I really don't like is like how many alerts your SIEM fires each month. You can collect the data and report it, and then you refine it over time. And you walk through a journey from the base metric, where you go next, etc. I'll show you some examples towards the end of my presentation, what makes a good metric and like things that you should think about as you build these out. What you really want to think about before you even pick any sort of metric is who your audience of that metric is going to be. Somebody has to receive that metric at the end of the day. It should have a purpose of what it tells that person or that group of people. One of the typical ways of thinking about this is operational metrics versus executive metrics. There's things that we want to know in the Security Operations Center. How many of our alerts, which we triage, are false positives, false negatives, and how we refine that over time. Somebody in the boardroom doesn't know SIEM, really might not know what that actually means. If you tell them something like our security analysts or our security team was 150% utilized this month, it's clearly telling the story that our team is overworked and we might need more personnel or more capabilities to sort of ease the workload. One of the best ways that you can really think about building your metrics is using the STAR methodology, or you might have seen it as STAR goals. Everybody who's listening has probably gone for a performance evaluation in their career at some point. And often what they talk about, defining career goals using STAR. Metrics can have exactly the same sort of points to use for this. Like, metrics should really be specific. If I tell somebody my SIEM triggers X amount of alerts per day, what does that actually mean? Are all alerts the same? It's difficult for somebody to actually really understand what that means. An alert in a SIEM could be anything. It could be a simple failed login event, or it could be like a malware outbreak. There's a large variety of things. So your metrics really should be specific about what you're trying to report on. They should also be measurable as well. The number of alerts fired really doesn't tell us that much in terms of measure. If I report a number of alerts, do I want it to be higher? Do I want it to be lower? I don't really know. There's not really like a way for me to say, like, I want 500 alerts to trigger, and if I have more than that, I've got to reduce the number of alarms that I've got defined. That's not really like a good way to deal with that. One of the most important ones, which I've actually highlighted here, is they should be actionable. Like, any metric that you define should have an outcome or something that can be done if it is good or bad. If I say number of alerts fired, what do I actually do if it goes above my threshold or lower than my threshold? Do I start turning off detections inside my SIEM? Do I start adding more? Like, it should be actionable. If we think of something a little bit better, if my analysts are like working more man hours than they're quoted for, we have an action where we can say, how do we reduce that analyst workload? Do we need more analysts? Do we need to build better detections because they're all like just producing lots of alerts that are useless? There should be an action attributed to what the metric. They should also be relevant. Like, coming back to the know your audience piece, in the SOC, we want to know things like false positive rates on our alerts. We don't necessarily care about how much time Bob spent watching Netflix on the back shift in the middle of the night when there isn't many alarms triggering. They could be time related. In SIEM, this is relatively straightforward speaking, because everything is time related, because most things are time sequence logs. It could be like how much of our metric is per day, per month, per week, per hour, those sorts of things. That should be pretty easy to tick off straight away. I'm sure like you've had this lecture from your managers at some point about defining goals. Think about how you can leverage that for metrics as well. What your metrics should help you do, you should think about what you want your metrics to highlight. Common things are like, explain how your team is working with your SIEM. Are your analysts overworked, underworked? Is the SIEM making their life easier or harder? How's your SIEM running? You might ask things like, do we have the right logs? Do we have the right alarms? Do we have the coverage against something like MITRE or something like that? These are things that you could put into metrics as well. You should also use them to identify improvement opportunities. If my team spent all day filtering false positives, I want to know so that we can look at the alarm set they're investigating, try and reduce the time that they spend doing that. They can also highlight things like resource gaps, right? If we have a triage process which goes into workflow of like analysts, and we have like level 2 and level 3 analysts, like you can highlight things like, are my cases waiting a long time for an L3 to pick up a case versus an L1 triaging an alert? So you can identify things like that as well. Your metric should also have some of these things, right? We've talked about this as we've gone through, but it really should have a defined purpose. When we talk about bringing logs in SIEM, if a log doesn't produce an alarm, a report, a dashboard, a visualization, if it doesn't have a purpose, it doesn't belong in your SIEM. Same thing when you're writing a metric. If you write a metric and it doesn't have a purpose, if it doesn't have a reason, you really shouldn't be spending time collecting it and reporting on it. You should also have a defined audience for each of your metrics. Like I said about the operational versus executive, you might have a set of metrics that you want to evaluate from a technical point of view or from like a boots on the ground standpoint, which help you in your day-to-day running of your SOC. You might also want metrics that you then report up to higher level management, which tell them things about how your team's performing and things that basically to show that your sim is actually worth the money that you spend on it. You should also have defined good and bad values for all your metrics, right? If you have a metric and it has a purpose and an audience, you should also be able to say what the value, the outcome of that metric is when it's good and it's bad. If it's good, we've achieved what we want from it. If it's bad, we need to improve that metric. Now what I'm really going to do is just show you a practical example of building a metric from scratch and maturing it over time. Coming back to that crawl, walk, run, what we have is the one that I've been beating on the whole time, is this alerts fired. Alerts fired is a metric. It tells us a thing. It's purely numeric, right? It just says how many alerts did our sim generate each month. It's probably going to be similar month after month, and it's never going to go up or down, or it might fluctuate slightly, but it's very difficult to quantify. If we just say, look at it from another angle, right? Not every alert in our sim is going to be looked at by an analyst. How many alerts do our analysts actually pick up and work each month? How many alerts are triaged? That's what I was going to say. An analyst should be able to say triage 4 alerts an hour, spending 15 minutes of each. And that allows us to basically say things like, are our analysts overworked? Do we need more? We can also do something rather than saying we work X amount of hours. We can say, we can turn that into a percentage and say, are our analysts utilized properly? Are they overutilized? Things like that. And that can be directly translated into dollars and cents for something in a management room where they can say, we're spending all this money on resources. We're also understaffed. If you want to build like a really complete metric, you could do something like this exercise, and it's not completely scientific. If you have an alert that's triggered in your sim, go to the end devices that contributed logs towards that alarm, log into those devices manually, look through the logs, write up our notes, and then pass it to the next level analyst and see how long it takes them to do that. I can almost bet you that it takes them longer than 15 minutes to do. And if it does, you now have a metric to say, for every alert that takes us 15 minutes to triage in the sim, we actually save X amount of time from doing it in the sim versus like doing it manually on our end device. So your reported metric is now, our sim saves us X amount of analyst hours during this time period, whether that's like per day, per week, per month, etc. That can be directly attributed to a cost saving from your sim. A cost saver, this would allow you to say your sim actually saves you money, not cost you money, because you're spending less on human time versus technology time. You can think about that another way, right? You can think of it as a journey across maturity. You can think about a basic metric is the number of alerts fired, walking all the way through to that really complete metric of analyst hours saved, coming back to that crawl, walk, run. You really don't need to have it perfect for the first time round. Before I leave you, I just want to address what is probably an elephant in the room and what probably some people might want to ask. Why didn't I talk about what you've probably read, if you've read any threat report or anything on security metrics? Why didn't I talk about mean time to detect, mean time to resolve, and these things? Every sort of report and blog that you probably read on security metrics tells you that these are the things that you absolutely must report on. I don't disagree that you should report on these. What I would say is you should have a collection of metrics that feed into these overarching ones to really report on those, rather than just saying our mean time to detect was 5 hours or something like that. You should really report on how long it takes you to detect each different type of attack, and those are better metrics because they're much more specific. It also allows you to identify those attack metrics or those attack vectors that are taking a longer time to report on. I did talk about this at one point, aligning to frameworks, MITRE or the cyber kill chain. You might also read things that tell you should report on your coverage of detections versus things, and you should totally do that. Coming back to the know your audience, like someone at a board level probably has no clue what it actually means if you have detections for 90% of MITRE. They really want to think in dollars and cents terms. Hopefully I've given you a lot of food for thought about metrics. It's not a terribly exciting topic, although I get excited about it. Hopefully I've highlighted the importance of writing metrics and value in your sim, not just write cool detection rules. Sometimes you need to do the not so sexy work to facilitate being able to do the sexy work. Ultimately, if you can't justify the money you spend on your sim, and all you say is, I need a sim, you might just end up with the cheapest option on the market. If you come in with that mindset and you don't have a way to measure it, all sims are the same. Hopefully you've learned something. Thanks, everybody. Bye.